All right, welcome guys. I think we are live here as we're getting ready to get this webinar kicked off. We're going to give it about 90 seconds to let folks get logged on and loaded. While we wait, if you are already here in the chat box there in the chat room, let us know where you're dialing in from today. We'll get kicked off here in another 60 seconds or so, but glad that you guys are with us, and we'll let the webinar attendees all come aboard and out of the green room, if you will. Thank you all for being here. Ann Arbor, Michigan, we've got Dan. Welcome this morning. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and press. People will probably join us. St. Augustine, Florida. I think I recognize that name, perhaps. Doylestown, PA. Tyler, welcome. Looks like we've got a lot of folks joining us, so we'll go ahead and press forward. I want to welcome you all to the 8th webinar of the year in the webinar series conducted by Hunt Scanlon Media. These are always a great time to get together. A huge thank you goes out to Scott Scanlon, Michael Hawkins, Walker Manning, who's manning things behind the scenes. So we appreciate you guys. I'm going to introduce our brain trust here for the discussion today in just a minute. But first, let me set the table on how the next 58 minutes or so are going to go. Today, we're focusing on the subject of the importance of middle management in portfolio company operations and success. It's a subject that is pretty relevant for our time. I was just sharing with the team before we went live that so many recruiters, being that we're in the recruiter space, so many recruiters focus so intently on the C-suite that middle managers tend to be a segment that doesn't have a whole lot of executive recruiter activity in it. And so we get asked about that a lot with the private equity firms that we're hiring for. They'll say, you know, can you help us with more of a mid-manager? So it's an important topic. Looking forward to getting the perspectives of our panelists on the subject. The webinar format, I'm going to do an introduction quickly with the panelists. I'm going to let them give their bios rather than me read it. And then after that, we're going to move into a discussion with the panelists. We'll have a few questions that I'll field, see if we can build some content around that. And then after about 10, 12 minutes, we'll pivot into a Q&A session. So if you have a question about the subject or any of the content that we've covered up to that point, enter it into the chat box. Walker's going to be managing those. I'll keep an eye on it, and we'll see if we can't ask and answer the question that you pose in the chat room. And then after that, a couple minutes of that, we'll pivot back to the panelists for another 10, 12-minute dialogue, finish up with a very brief Q&A session at the end. So have a hard stop at 12 noon. That's our commitment, to get you guys back to your day so as not to monopolize your time. So we're going to be going till 12 noon, and then that's 57 minutes from now, and then we'll close it down. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to turn towards our panelists and allow them to introduce themselves, who they are, tell us a little bit about your company and the role that you play there. So rather than me reading a bio and have you all sit through that, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. And so, being that chivalry is not dead, Robbie Allen, we're going to let the ladies go first. So first up, Lindsey Webb of E78 Partners in Chicago, Illinois. Good morning, Lindsey. Tell us about you.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate all of that background in the intro. Lindsey Webb, head of talent acquisition for E78 Partners, have been in the talent acquisition realm for a little over 10 years, much of which has been actually spent in private equity-backed advisory organizations. So E78 is a consulting firm that is geared towards private equity, both in the fund and actually within their portcos. So this subject is certainly close to home for us, even if it's not in an actual capacity and more in a consulting realm. But yeah, I'm excited to chat with everyone today.
Super. Thanks for being here. Melanie Brensinger is from Anagenesis Capital Partners, a New York City private equity firm defector to South Florida, the state of the headquarters of Tolan Group. So welcome. As a fellow Floridian down there, Melanie, tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you so much for opening up our chat today. I'm really looking forward to the dialogue. Again, my name is Melanie Brensinger. I'm the founder and managing partner of Anagenesis Capital Partners. We're a healthcare focused private credit fund. We're deploying a little over $270 million into all different types of healthcare, primarily services, but across the healthcare spectrum. And we deploy debt and equity in our strategy. And prior to founding Anagenesis, I was at GE Capital in the healthcare financial services team, so really focused on healthcare for a very long time. I won't say how many years because that'll age me, but for a very long time. And this topic is near and dear to my heart. Certainly, as Tim mentioned, I think so many people focus on that executive kind of C-suite when looking at deals and evaluating deals and really promoting talent. But the middle management is really where I think a lot of the company's decisions are driven. So really excited to be here today and being part of this discussion.
Super, fantastic. And last but not least, Robbie Allen, an accomplished entrepreneur, senior executive, currently the CEO of a private equity-backed healthcare company. Not too much that Robbie hasn't done, and recently married Robbie Allen, I might add. So congratulations to picking up a significant other. So, Robbie, tell us about yourself.
Well, thanks. That's the important role, that and father or stepfather to 11 kids. So,
oh my God.
Not Catholic, not Mormon. Just didn't want 12.
Maybe a little crazy, but that's for another time.
Yeah, I'm the CEO of 1GI. It's a national consolidator, upper middle market, private equity backed by Webster Equities. Reformed engineer, lifelong entrepreneur and CEO in healthcare. And the middle management talent pool is my love language. I believe it is the most important thing in any company. So happy to be here. Happy to kind of learn from everybody.
Well, I've been looking forward to the discussion, and we'll just go ahead and jump right in. I appreciate you guys, your time today, and those introductions. Just going to let the audience know, if you want to connect with these guys, look them up on LinkedIn, and they'll be sure and reach out if they're able to get that connection. But let's go ahead and, as a starting point of the discussion around the importance of middle management, perhaps it's best that we define what we mean. I think there's a lot of words thrown around and titles thrown around at the mid-management sector. So what roles or titles are we referring to when we consider the middle management of an organization? I'll let each of you weigh in, but maybe Lindsey, you can lead us off on that answer.
Yeah, so obviously from a talent perspective, that can run the gamut, right? So in preparing for this, I kind of started thinking and talking and reading some stuff, and I actually found a really great article, and I think it's from McKinsey, but don't quote me on that, where it described really what middle management was, and I'll use an analogy, and it's really that middle management are principals, right? If you think about a principal of a school, they're responsible for something. They generally have a layer underneath them, an assistant principal or other folks, but then they're very close to your individual contributors, which we would consider teachers. But most people forget that principals roll into an assistant superintendent, a superintendent who rolls into someone else, but they're still very much responsible for either a segment or a business unit, right? And there is a lot of responsibility that they own. Without sort of using titles, I really liked that. The analogy, I think, really much fit when you think about the structure of kind of school systems and how that would then work within, a broader organization. So I would say I think of that because otherwise titling, it'd be all over the place if we were to sit here and pick at that.
No, that's a great analogy too. I hadn't thought about that. So an excellent point. Melanie, how would you define that?
Yeah, it's Lindsey, I love that. I love that analogy for sure. I kind of struggle with the same idea because depending on the size of the organization and the company, it could take many forms. For me, just a broad-based view of that is kind of that SVP level. So if you see like an SVP of operations or SVP of IT or VP of growth. So kind of if you're thinking about an org chart, that next layer down from whomever and how many people are sitting at the top, and then again having operational functional roles and individuals underneath them. So in an org chart, I would say that second layer of the org chart is how I think about middle management.
Excellent.
I'll jump in, Tim. I'm not shy. We broadly categorize them as everybody between a frontline manager and me, and the C-suite. So I'm not talking about the people that report directly to me, but that level of my 9 direct reports between them and the frontline managers.
Excellent. I know it's oftentimes based on the company size. Robbie, you kind of just answered this particular question, but of the roles just mentioned, who do they report to? Is it always the CEO? Is it somebody that's junior executive team, senior mid-management? Who's the typical direct report for middle management?
It depends. It's entirely dependent on the scale of the organization. Most organizations start with their first level of middle management at the VP level as they grow. And that VP level then grows directors and senior directors and things like that underneath them as an ecosystem of middle management all the way down to the front line. At national scale, it's not uncommon to have 3 or 4 layers of middle management. And so the reporting structure is generally by department, generally by sort of subject matter focus, whether that's HR, operations, finance, revenue cycle.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think it's certainly going to depend on the thickness of layers, right, in an organization, and that's going to vary. But a lot of times, I mean, I think you see it with, not right under the C-suite, but the next level down, and even maybe potentially the level below that. That's usually kind of the sweet spot of where you'll find them.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think the reason for the question is a lot of times that becomes the grooming or the mentoring role, right? I think oftentimes the proximity to that senior level executive, Robbie, in your case, the CEO, there's just so much mentorship. There's so much learning that can be done by this person. And eventually, when there is a talent upgrade or a transition, you've got a pretty strong bench to be able to look to maybe fill that role. So awesome. Very good. Why is solid leadership so important at the mid-level management sector? I know it's probably a real obvious question, but I think it's, given the role that middle managers play, it's important for them, the middle manager, to understand the goals and the objectives of the senior leadership. And those that are investor backed, obviously, there's a accountability component to the private equity firm. So why is solid leadership at the mid-level management hierarchy, why is that so important, Melanie?
Yeah, I would say, Tim, I absolutely agree with that statement. If you think about how to drive things within an organization, you certainly need to have the vision, strategy, culture, and the direction of the business being driven by the executive management team. But if that next layer of management hasn't bought into that, it's not likely that that's going to roll out more broadly. Or if they are opposite and are detractors from what's being suggested at the top, that can also become very pervasive across the entire organization. I also think that the middle management is usually where things start to bubble up. Something is going on. They're probably the people who hear and see about it first. And I think their reaction to whatever they're hearing from the boots on the ground across the organization will really drive kind of the next several steps. So there's been several situations I could think about where, and this is why site visits are so important and spending time with your companies, where I've been out with companies and, the C-suite may think, I guess, or say that everything is great, but then you spend some time in the kitchen or in the restroom or in the hallway and you hear things, right? And I think that middle management has the opportunity to grab onto some of those things and take control of it before it escalates or moves across the entire industry. And the same way, if they see something really great happening, they can also be the big champions for promotions and really highlighting some of the success stories. So I just think they're I wouldn't say as critical as the C-suite, but I think often they're overlooked and from my perspective, the ones who can really drive quite a bit at the company level.
Yeah, I think the piece, Tim, that you're from a function of scale, which is typically what you're always asked to do with a PE portfolio company. The goal is to grow to a scale. We can argue about what that scale is, but the gating factor to growth and scale is functionally your middle management. And I think it's important to recognize that that's the first level that we expect to see the skills associated with leadership, because it's entirely different than management skills. It's not better or worse, but it's different. Can you lead a regional market and deliver expected results in that market through your managers? Because at this point, it is now influence management once you have hit national scale. So you are depending on this middle layer. I visit offices, but there are hundreds of people between me and the line personnel out there. So we have to have a really solid leadership effect throughout that middle management. And you're right, it's that bench strength of development and that development of the capability set around using that leadership that generally moves people into larger roles throughout the upper middle management chain.
No, excellent point. And maybe a good segue into this next question, or maybe statement. Would you agree or disagree with the following statement? And that statement is, senior leadership has to be able to trust their direct reports to lead as they would. And maybe that's the emphasis on those last three words. But again, senior leadership has to be able to trust their direct reports to lead as they would. Would you say you agree or disagree, or what would your context be about that particular question? Melanie, how about you?
Yeah, I would say, Tim, I would lean on not necessarily agreeing with that, primarily because of those last three words. I think that, for me, having different leadership styles, different ways in which we all manage is really the great juice of a large organization and even a small organization. And I don't know, frankly, even that C-suite executives want to have, little clones running around their companies. I think certainly the vision and the strategy and just the mission certainly needs to be aligned as the C-suite sees it. But how they actually execute on the plan, I think it's almost opposite, that it's really important to have that individual style and touch to it. And that middle management also knows their people best. And, sometimes as you continue to pivot down into an organization, you'll hear someone saying like, wow, the CEO, we don't necessarily like, him or her, or, there might be some disconnect there, but they really like their direct manager. So, and I think that the function of the C-suite and who those people are and their soft and technical skills is different from middle management. And so the styles also, I think, vary quite quickly and differently. And so I would say I would lean to less agreement than more agreement there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm complete agreement. I think that the term that was coming to mind is, you don't want yes people, right? You need people who are going to challenge you in a healthy way about approach, but are also, acting in your capacity with a strategic vision. But it doesn't necessarily need to fit in a perfect box, right? And done a specific way because you would do it that way. I think that's why you want that. And I know we're going to get into a lot of, things in around diversity, but I think having different views and approaches is really important, especially at that level. And to Melanie's point, those are the people that are really going to drive a lot and have a little bit more visibility into sort of the front line than you would. And so I think it is healthy to have people that can challenge you. Ultimately, the goal is the goal, but the way in which they get there isn't necessarily the same.
Great points. Great points. Robbie, this is maybe something you can speak to directly.
It is. I often say you have to make your leadership style authentic to you, not use mine. To all the people that work in the organization with me, I will say this: if as a senior leadership team you are properly educating and communicating the values of the organization and demonstrating them, and your middle management leadership is adopting and making those their own, their leadership style, regardless of what it looks like, provided it's not caustic, is going to be their own, and it's going to work. They're going to get, or you're going to make a change. That's really the way that we look at it. It has to be about the values inside your organization and the culture.
And I think that kind of, as we pivot, I want to go into the expectations of senior leaders for their mid-management teams. And I think we kind of covered the point of synergy, how important that is. The inconsistency of message can have damning results, the further down the chain it goes. And so there's a definite need for synergy. So, but maybe as expounding on that just a little bit, to the point that there isn't synergy, or maybe there's the inevitable conflict that arises. Senior management has this, mid-management has that. Maybe there's not congruence in ideologies or strategy or whatever, and it can be seen as the conflict, if you will. What's the best path forward for conflict resolution? I remember in college I had a class and it was crisis management, and the prof stood up and he said, notice the title of this class, it's not crisis avoidance, because sometimes you can't avoid it, but you can manage it. So if there develops a crisis or some kind of an inequity between senior level management and middle management, how is that addressed, or what would you recommend to be a conflict resolution strategy? And maybe Robbie, will let you start off on that one. Hopefully it's not a regular day occurrence for you, but I'd love to know how you would deal with such.
We manage physician practices, so we have no shortage of conflict. I will say this personally, and one of the real basic tenets of how I tend to run organizations is I and my team work for the organization. And if you approach conflict and situations that way, in other words, I'm an expense item. So if the conflict is down in the organization, then it's my job to go to the conflict. And I think when we, instead of calling people to the hill, and we approach sort of with this notion of proximity and resolution, the success there is almost always related to the attitude with which the senior team enters the fight. Because if you come at it as a fight, it will be a fight. If you come at it as, I'm here to help, we move away from this sort of victimized and accuser scenario, and we move into a resolution framework.
Yeah, I was going to say listening. I think listening is a big one, right? Again, to Robbie's point, even Melanie's before, the proximity that they have to the inner workings of the organization, they're going to have a lot more visibility. They're going to hear a lot more. And so they may be just sort of a vehicle for bubbling things up that exists lower, in the organization. But I think the listening piece of it, not necessarily having to resolve everything out of the gates, looking at things from what's a long-term goal that we could fix this, but what are some short-term wins that we could do? I think going in to Robbie's point, it's the way in which you insert yourself into the conversation versus being combative instead of let me hear you, right? People really want to be heard, and that level really does get most of the feedback, or in general is going to understand sort of where conflict exists in the organization.
Great point. Great point.
I was just going to add to that, Tim. I think also, if you think about why conflict may arise in the first place, what I find oftentimes is it's really a communication misunderstanding in many ways. So to that point about listening, sometimes it can be resolved by, to Robbie's point, going there and just really understanding what's happening. And maybe you can't change everything, but there are some small adjustments that I think can be had when a conflict happens that can really just change the level of transparency and understanding. And so I think, you don't necessarily have to get to a conflict to have those listening experiences. And I think there's a lot of ways in which, especially larger companies, tackle some of that employee input and just constant checking in that I think can really avoid some of those big, conflict blowups that could inevitably happen over time.
Yeah, Melanie and Tim, one thing I didn't mention, that to pair it off of Melanie, it really helps to get your entire team, all of your managers on a common language. Something as simple as, wow, that was not the reaction I expected to what I just said. What did you hear? Is a very different way to get people to think about, why did Melanie just blow up when I said that I was giving her a raise? Well, that's not what she heard. Instead, when she tells you back, well, you think I'm terrible. It's just a very different way.
Yeah, the words really matter. It reminds me, I was at a board meeting yesterday and we were talking about, the company made a statement like, we're not going to have K-cups anymore for the coffee. And this got translated across the company that the company was taking away the coffee service. And so there was this whole big to-do about taking away the coffee service. And they said, no, we're not taking away the coffee. We're just not doing K-cups. And, I was sitting there for a moment and I said, why are you not doing K-cups to help the environment or save the environment? They're like, no, actually, because so many people take the K-cups home. And so there was this whole thing about, I said, well, maybe you could have framed it up like you're trying to be environmentally conscious. They're like, oh my gosh, we never thought about that. And so it's so funny how something as simple as taking away K-cups had turned into this, whole thing about taking away coffee service and why did that happen? And even something as small as that probably warranted a little bit more clear communication.
And that's a serious issue, I might add.
Yeah.
Certain things you don't mess with. The coffee service is one of them. So
Exactly.
great point. But we are at 25 past the hour. I think this would be a good time to maybe turn towards the chat box. If you have a comment, a question you want to ask, this would be a good time to list it in the chat box. I do see that Ron Viejo had mentioned kind of a statement more than a question. And he says, hopefully senior leaders have enough ego strength to hear stuff from their middle managers that they don't necessarily want to hear, but must hear. I kind of think I know what the inference is to that statement. Anybody want to wade in on that and maybe respond to the statement?
I'll put my neck out. If they don't have that kind of ego strength, then you need to make a change. I'll just tell you flat out. If you've got managers that don't, especially in the higher ranks of middle management, but I would argue anywhere, you got to make a change. It's the single most caustic thing in larger organizations, and it becomes the barrier to scale.
Yeah. Lindsey, how about you? What do you think about the statement?
I'm in full agreement. I mean, you have to be open to criticism and feedback at any level, right? I think we all do. And so if you aren't, then you are kind of impeding, I would think, the vision of the firm and the success, to Robbie's point, to scale. You're not going to experience it if you can't receive that kind of information and then solution for it.
And sometimes it can be kind of a dual-edged sword, right? Because the ego of somebody could be the reason for the success to that level, right? Maybe not that it's an egocentric organization, but they had a tough enough skin to get it to where it is and make it something that's attractive to a PE investor. Evelyn Rodstein has a question. Do you see middle managers caught in battles between departments because the senior team has not done enough to manage cross-functional conflict? Excellent question. What do you see middle managers caught in the middle, I guess is the abbreviated question there. Melanie, what would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I just it's interesting. Thank you for that question. Recently, we actually had an example of this where the company was growing quite quickly, and that finance division, if you will, was getting pulled and doing like all sorts of different growth reports, and got involved in some of the acquisition due diligence, some de novo things that were happening. And so they were getting pulled off of their direct duties. And then the senior team was like, oh, you're falling behind on your accounting duties. Like, yeah, but you're pulling me over here. Other teams are pulling me over here. And so there was this inherent conflict where the CFO said, all of you just really focus on the finance function. And of course, that can create all sorts of issues. So I think that's where some of the communication is really important at the C-suite level, I think, to say, we're all driving towards this same goal. And although you're the finance function, it's important to contribute to the broader goal as well. But then as a senior leadership team, you also have to understand you can't have those same expectations of people if you are wanting them to be pulled different directions. So again, I think quite a bit of it just comes down to communication and understand and making sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction, and then giving flexibility for timelines when you can, if you're going to pull people off the front line, to have them do something else.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have a Dr. C.G. Oldraji, I'm sure I butchered that last name, Ultraji, Dr. Ultraji, is in PE context. Aren't CEOs really middle managers? I think as we look at the hierarchy and maybe the family tree of private equity firm, organization, C-suite, I think that could be said yes, kind of, but I won't answer for those in the sector. So Lindsey, would you see a Portco CEO as a middle manager?
I certainly think that an argument could be made that that's true. I'm laughing and looking at Robbie, thinking that this is a good one for him to answer. But certainly, if you think from a hierarchy standpoint and where, you know, the growth or the direction of a company is going, some, you know, that is going to be driven by the private equity organization that owns them. And so I think to an extent you could say that. I would think that they have a bit more influence than maybe a middle manager does to an extent, but yes, I certainly think an argument could be made that they are in that level as well. But I'd be curious Robbie's thoughts here.
And he's got one, I know.
It's a fair question. And I think in small, lower middle market and lower market funds, I think you find that to be true more often. I think it's a sign of dysfunctional private equity board management when that's the case. Ideally, you want your portfolio to be the board allies of the senior management team. You know, you spend a lot of time and effort finding a CEO. You interact with your board directors in they are one of your constituencies. I think it's a fallacy to think that they are your only constituency in well-run platform companies. Even the PE guys who are your sponsors will understand that you have multiple constituencies, including your employees and your investors, and oftentimes your community, depending on what you do. That has taken hold in the upper middle market segment, to be sure. So I see our sponsors at board meetings. So by no means am I being managed, but certainly if I'm going to bet the company on something, then I'm probably going to sit down with the board, and I would do the same in a public company or a family office or an ESOP.
Mm-hmm. And Melanie, since you would be in that private equity catbird seat, what would you see as your portfolio CEO's role? Do you see them as middle managers or something else?
No, I think that if that's how you're viewing your CEOs, you know, you really need to think about what you're doing, because most investment firms are not operators by training. So, you know, I say first and foremost, you know, if I'm running your company, we have a big problem. And probably conversely, if the CEOs are trying to do fund management, that's a big problem too. So, and then you throw in doctors into the mix, and we could have a healthy debate about that too. So I think that, you know, there has to be that respect that the CEO is not quote unquote working for you. They are running their organization and a company. You know, they may or may not be the entrepreneur, and although they quote unquote are your employee in some ways, if you tackle it that way, you're probably not going to have good successes, because just as the communication needs to flow from middle management to the C-suite, you don't want your C-suite and your CEO to not have transparent communication with you. And that's not going to happen if they feel like there's going to be a backlash, or you have expectations that they possibly could never meet and deliver to you. So I think the communication and just the openness and respect for one another's talents is just really critical.
One thing I think that is a theme coming out of the Brady Bunch box that is Melanie Brensinger today is communication.
Yes.
The importance of that, especially at this subject. Well, I appreciate the questions. We're going to pivot back to conversation as we head into the home stretch here. And maybe on the heels of what you guys just outlined, 2 or 3 characteristics. One thing I can say in the recruiting world is that we're starting to see a different core competency candidate criteria request out of some of our clients. And what I mean by that is, if there's something that the pandemic has taught us, it's that nobody had a page in their playbook for how to manage a company, no matter the size, through a national pandemic, right? Through a national shutdown. I have talked, we have quite a bit of searches in the nonprofit sector. I've talked to some incredible CEOs and how creative they got in virtual silent auctions and virtual 5K runs and things to raise funds. And so the creativity during that was really, there's some really inspiring stories. Some did it really well, some maybe not so much. But one of the characteristics that we're constantly asked now is, as you're talking to potential executives for us, we'd like to know what their conflict management strategy is, or how would they, or how did they manage through that difficult time. And one thing that constantly comes out is communication, right? The folks that did it well were very transparent. They didn't run from the ugly details and the hard news, whether it was adjustments in how we were going to make payroll or things that we were asking people to do, part-time hours come back. Even our company went through that. So the folks did it really well, and some maybe not so well. So with that as maybe a backdrop, other than conflict resolution as a candidate characteristic, what are one or two or maybe three things that you would hope for in a solid middle manager? And maybe Lindsey, we'll let you lead off on this one.
Yeah, I'll take point. I mean, obviously, I think the ability to lead and influence, right? Because that's really what you're requiring of those people. I also think it's the ability to develop talent. Again, they're a little bit closer to your individual contributors or your lower level managers, your frontline managers. I think it's really important that those people have buy-in of that individual, because when you think about from a leadership perspective, that probably is the closest that they are to true upper management. But I also think it's the ability to manage down, but manage up, right? And I think you're sort of prepping those people to take on additional responsibility down the road. You're hoping, but watching how they can also manage up. I think that's a critical function when you're assessing talent of, can they manage, obviously the team underneath them that they're going to have, but also, the upstream version of that and differing views, opinions, the strategic direction, and can they adapt to it? You want people that are adopters, that believe in where you're headed and are going to help drive that, because ultimately those are your execution people and the implementation people, and you need them to be on the bus.
Excellent. Robbie, thoughts on that?
I think I would approach it with layers, and it's just my larger organizational bias right now, but the closer they are to the front line, the more their ability to connect, to translate processes in sort of a managing up. That managing up ability is kind of fairly important at that lower level of middle management. As you get higher in the organization, your ability to connect, it layers on. The ability to communicate is always important, but the higher you go, your ability to communicate and persuade, because you are managing through influence, becomes critical. And so we tend to view the skills as things we can train, but those fundamental basic sets of almost personality traits are the things we're looking for there.
I would
Melanie,
definitely, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think one thing to add too is that to have a bit of empathy and understanding and inclusion at that level is really, really important. And not everybody is going to have a great day or a great, month or week or whatever it is. And I think, Tim, as you think about COVID, there's still people who are dealing with long COVID, who have family members who have passed from COVID, who, are now having people who've moved back in with them, whether it's kids or parents or uncles or aunts or whatever it is. And people's home lives, I think, have just changed through COVID. And I think being really aware of challenges that people are dealing with, and maybe there's just different mind shifts. I think to your point of view, we're alluding to, people's values of how they see the world. Certainly we see it have shifted a bit in through COVID. So I think those middle managers having the ability to have some empathy and understanding around what's really driving their individual employees, and perhaps maybe before reacting negatively, really asking the questions and trying to understand what's going on is important.
Melanie, would you add mistake tolerance to that? I'm curious your thoughts at the PE level, because one of the things we try to inculcate in our middle management is you got to iterate off mistakes. Let's make them small when we can, but let's learn from them and iterate.
Yeah, I would really, Robbie, it's a great point. Even in my own career, I think the ability to say, I don't know, or to, allow my employees to say, I don't know, or allow them to not feel like if they make a mistake, it's going to be, death by a thousand lashes. Again, I mean, some mistakes are bigger than others, but I think giving a pathway to have a mistake and be able to have somebody come to you and say, I've made this mistake, and working through that, I think there's just such a great cohesiveness and trust that is developed there, where they feel like they can tell you anything. And even if you want to jump out of your skin, I think taking a pause and saying, let's work through this together. I mean, what a sense of relief. We've both been on I mean, we've all probably been on both sides of that. So I think there has to be a level of tolerance that not everybody is perfect. I definitely agree with that.
You know, Robbie, as a step parent of 11 kids, that might hit close to home. I've got 3 that are now grown and flown the nest, and I can tell you, there's times when the child tells you something and you just have to remain stoic, but everything inside of you is saying, I didn't just hear that, did I? Right? So
It's so important, Tim. If you just immediately react, is that child ever going to come back and want to tell you again? They're never going to come back to you. So
right.
that's a huge moment in the relationship that really can define what's going to happen on a go forward basis.
No, that's a great point. And I think to whoever it was that had mentioned the ego part, I think that's a big indicator, right? How a senior manager deals with a disappointment with one of their mid-manager team members. So certainly a great point there. I want to continue, maybe pivot to our final segment of the importance of middle management. We've talked about the importance. We've talked about the expectations of the senior level team of the middle manager. And now I want to kind of conclude our time with the impact that middle managers can have. And I think we've really covered a lot of this through the discussion up to this point, but maybe some more direct questions. I think ultimately the impact can't be overstated, because the size of the organization is obviously a part of this, but the bigger the company, the greater the chance of something that wasn't intended leaking down into the organization, polluting the well. So with that as a kind of a backdrop, how often should middle managers and senior leadership meet to discuss progress and maybe recalibrate if there's some things that need to be fixed? And not only how frequent, but as kind of an adjunct to that, in what capacity should they meet? Is there value to the senior level executives? What would you say are the frequency and the mode of meeting between senior leaders and middle management? And maybe Lindsey, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I would say certainly on a quarterly basis, you need to be having a pretty formal and documented conversation with your middle management. My hope would be that at a minimum, at least 2 of those are in person, right? Because I do think that it is critical, the FaceTime aspect of that. But I think everyone knows an ongoing conversation and dialogue around performance and expectation is necessary, and it doesn't always have to be in a formal setting, right? Whether that be informal on a monthly basis via video, taking people out, having conversations if you are live, coffee and lunch. But I do think from a thinking through, especially with KPIs and things like that, you need to have a quarterly documented conversation with people at that level.
Yeah, any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I would just add, I think we work pretty hard to make those quarterly conversations with middle and senior management on a weekend quarterly, to get rid of the distractions of what's going on. We try not to do it too often that way, but when you pair that type of intensity with what I think Lindsey was alluding to, which is this continuous conversation of what's going on, because we preach proximity. You have to find ways in the pandemic to be proximal to your managers. Sometimes that's Zoom calls, sometimes that's simply sending them a note, but you have to generate that, and we expect that out of the senior middle management and certainly the executive team. And so that has to be continuous and paired with these more intense periods of connection.
And Melanie, maybe a question I would ask of you directly. How involved would a PE sponsor, or does an investment company, how involved should a middle manager be? Is there value, or is there not value from a private equity firm perspective in having a middle manager as part of maybe accountability team, or update meetings, or whether that's done monthly, quarterly, whatever? I know sometimes the board assembles just to get a progress report. Is there value, or is there not value in having middle management present at those? And is it something that doesn't really happen very often, or is it a common occurrence?
Yeah, I think that, it's a great question, Tim, because if the private equity firm and frankly the C-suite wants buy-in from the middle management. Middle management needs to know what they're buying into, and so where I've seen that work really well is I've seen boards. I mean, you don't want to blast out your board deck to your entire company or your middle management, but I have seen situations where perhaps the middle manager and the finance function might come into the board meeting for that particular segment when we're going through the financials, and because eventually maybe that person will become the new CFO. So to be able to have exposure of like, wow, this is actually what happens at this board meeting. I think involving them in board meetings in a select way can be really interesting. The other thing that I've seen is breakout sessions around board meetings. So perhaps you bring in all of middle management and maybe C-suite isn't even there. You bring in a facilitator to kind of talk about what's working, what's not working. And then there's a lot of cross collaboration because sometimes the middle managers also don't have a lot of direct dialogue or the ability to collaborate and work through things together. Or maybe that one middle manager doesn't want to just raise their hand and take on, an initiative. But if they can do it in a way where they can kind of all come together and have facilitated discussions, it can be pretty powerful. So I love meeting with middle management. Again, I try to for our companies, and we have a smaller portfolio than a mega fund, but I love meeting with middle management. I learn so much, and sometimes I'll take those things back to the C-suite and say, have you thought about that? And they haven't told us that, and that's an aha moment. Go spend more time with the team. You might learn some things. So I think it is really important.
I think it goes a long way too, then in really presenting credibility, maybe giving some, showing some respect to the middle manager that may seem like a behind the scenes partner, right? There's a sense of, hey, I matter, right? I got to see at the big kids table, if you will, when the PE firm is that visible to mid management, knowing that it's not possible in some of the bigger funds. I cut you off, Lindsey. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I was just going to agree with Melanie. I think certainly the exposure piece of that is important, but again, it lends itself into the buy-in, right? Getting them bought in on the strategic vision and what this means for them, right? We're very much in a what's in it for me culture, and so people really want to understand where's the company headed and where do I fit into that. Mm-hmm. And so giving them that visibility of the direction, but also understanding, it's helping them develop. They're getting to see the decision tree, right? And the process that goes into the decision making around the board and senior leadership. But I've also seen this where, to Melanie's point, you can kind of do it in a different avenue or platform. I've seen where kind of senior management or the C-suite has actually done a condensed version and sort of a debrief of the board meetings as well, which I think is really impactful because, again, it gives them visibility, not that they need to have all of the information, but giving them enough nuggets that they can take back, then they really understand sort of where the company is headed and where they fit into that. And I think that's important for people.
I echo that. We do exactly that. Each departmental C-suite executive kind of takes that board deck and messages it back down through their organization. We also bring market leadership into the board on a rotating basis. So a market vice president might pop into this next board meeting from Cleveland. And then the following board meeting, we might have a Texas market vice president there. So just to begin to expose that operational leadership to reporting and to give our board visibility on who the middle managers are.
Oh, great point. Great point. But we're up against, we're about 12 minutes out. So this will be our last question, then we'll pivot back to the chat room if there's additional questions. And if there's not, we'll certainly sign off, let you guys resume your day. But as we think about culture in an organization, it's everybody's responsibility, right? Culture, the temperature of the company is everyone's responsibility. But I think it's an old axiom that everything starts at the top, right? An organization will only be as effective as its weakest link, and an organization will take on the culture of its top leaders. So with that kind of as a backdrop, two questions, and I'll let you answer them however you choose. But the impact that middle managers have on culture, maybe expound on that a little bit. How much can a middle manager affect company culture? And then as an adjunct, and maybe it should be a separate question, but in the interest of time, so much emphasis today in the business climate at large is on diversity of candidates, and diversity has got multiple subsects to it. But with culture and diversity, I think those can kind of go hand in hand. So what impact does middle management have on creating culture? And then how important is it to have diversity evidenced in the middle management ranks as opposed to maybe senior leadership? Obviously, senior leaders are the face of the organization, so it's important to have diversity represented there. But at the middle management level, that could be seen as maybe more bad term, but back of the house kind of folks. How important is diversity at the middle management level? So kind of a two-part question. Maybe Lindsey, you can go first, and then Melanie, and then Robbie. We'll let you kind of.
Well, I actually think I'm going to lob it over to them because this is sort of a layup one for me, probably a little bit. So I'll round up. I'll bring it back. I'd be more curious to hear what they think, and then certainly from my view can round it out.
So go ahead, Melanie. We'll let you go on that one.
All right. So just to be a little provocative here at the end of our webinar, I'll say, I think, Tim, that one thing that I've noticed is a lot of people talk about diversity to talk about diversity versus actually understanding what diversity really means. And I think the inherent go-to on diversity is either race or gender. There is so much more about diversity. I mean, if anybody has experienced through family and friends through COVID and, January 6th or whatever it is, all these things that are happening politically and all the things that have divided our country over the last few years. I mean, you can lose friends and family members over, what you even thought about a vaccination at this point. So I think that so much of diversity is diversity of thought. And experiences in life. And it certainly has to do with race and gender, but there can be some pretty disparate views right now and misalignment with how people think about things. And so from my perspective, it's not just about having a diverse workforce, whether it be gender or race, but also diversity of thought, experiences, and talent, and even people coming from non-traditional backgrounds versus, quote unquote, traditional backgrounds of, in the investment world, for example, like everyone coming from Ivy League schools versus going to, kind of that second layer of schools where you can recruit. And then I think what also gets lost in diversity is the inclusion element of it. So if you start to hire a bunch of diverse talent and then you don't have an inclusive culture, those people are not going to stay. And then people will say, well, we can't retain these people. And so I think the inclusion part is quite often lost in the diversity conversation. And I would argue the inclusion part is somewhat even more important than the diversity side, because for companies, when you hire somebody, I mean, Robbie, you sure know, and Lindsey, it's a huge time commitment and dollar commitment to bring people on. And if you have significant churn, especially at key positions, it can be really disruptive for the company. So diversity is important, but inclusion is critical to sustaining that culture on a go-forward basis, from my perspective.
I think I would pile on the thought. The best quote I've heard about this is diversity is everybody being asked to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance, and equity is being asked to plan the dance. And if you can't follow through on all three of those, then it really doesn't matter what you're looking at hiring, because you're not going to create the culture where they want to stay. And that becomes the gating factor. I would say that representation matters, which may be a slight different, especially in larger organizations. People need to be able to look and see that it's not, as one of our leadership training classes made a t-shirt for me that said old, white, and uptight. And so, and it was a joke. So for those of you that connect with me on LinkedIn, you'll see the story there, but it is true, right? And so I think what they were saying was, we'd like to see a little more representation, because to add the back end of that story, in my opinion, culture comes from the middle. We can model directionally what it is we would like it to be. I preach kindness and inclusion and respect all day long. if it's not coming out of the middle and I'm not demonstrating those values myself, it just doesn't matter. The middle will create their own culture. And that's where you spot dysfunction in organizations. Usually leading edge indicators are turnover rates, kind of caustic back channels and things like that. So
what a great point. Inclusion more so than just diversity itself. And Robbie, I'm always looking for content. So if you would please list those 3 points on LinkedIn so I can share it.
Absolutely.
I love that. That was a great analogy with the dance. I don't know why the movie Napoleon Dynamite comes to mind, but that's what popped into my head when you said that. But
Tim, I thought you were going to ask him to get you one of those T-shirts.
Yeah,
I'd love to see it for sure. Lindsey,
There's
you
a
were going to
picture of
kind of
it.
round us out on this subject.
So, I mean, well-made points. Melanie pretty much hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that diversity isn't just, race, sexual orientation. It's diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds, but really it's just acknowledging that there's difference in characteristics and circumstances and backgrounds. And the inclusion piece of that is then allowing that to be valued and people being able to feel as though that can help contribute to their role within the organization. So, to Melanie's point, I think a lot you hear these buzzwords and these terms and people want to check boxes, but it's really ensuring that your mid-managers think about that, because I also think about the fact that those are generally your hiring managers, right? They are the people sort of perpetuating the culture, whether that be creating, clones of themselves. Are they looking for diverse people within their actual organization as well? They are going to drive a lot of the culture that exists, and that can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. And so really ensuring that they understand, what the firm is looking for, what that profile looks like, and not just kind of staying within one particular box. It's pretty important because those are generally going to be your hiring managers. And I obviously, from a talent perspective, think about how critical that is, that they're looking for people from non-traditional backgrounds, going to schools that maybe they didn't go to or other people went to, and thinking about it in a very, holistic way versus a very singular way, because that can just quickly create a culture that is, you've got to click within certain organizations, and that creates problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. All points are fantastic on that. It's a subject that honestly could be a subject of a webinar. Diversity has actually been a subject of Hunt Scanlon's webinar series in the past. So there are some webinars in the Hunt Scanlon archives about the subject that might be worth looking at. We've only got 3 minutes left, so I don't know that there's a whole lot of time for a Q&A. I do want to thank those that participated. Denise Graziano was saying such a worthwhile conversation. Thank you for all your insights. So that's directed to you panelists. And then Dan Corser, I think, said the same thing. Excellent insights. Thanks for sharing. So ultimately, I want to thank you guys for taking time. Melanie, I'm sorry for your travel interruptions. Good luck getting home whenever that happens.
Thank you very much. And, I appreciate it.
Really do appreciate you guys taking time out of your schedules to be with us. And hopefully this was beneficial to you as much as it was to those that attended. So until next time, everybody, I want to thank Hunt Scanlon Media. I want to thank our panelists, and certainly you guys that attended for giving us your ear for an hour. Hopefully this was helpful. And until we do this again, so long, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.